Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the peculiar morning routines of Victorian scientists. Picture it. It's early in the morning, still dark outside, and a chilling fog hangs in the air. You pull yourself out of a warm bed, but instead of stretching and slowly starting the day like most of us, you're about to immerse yourself in freezing water or engage in some other outlandish habit. You probably won't survive this one. But don't worry. These scientists believe their odd rituals help them tap into new heights of productivity and creativity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there. Always curious to see how far this journey stretches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As the 19th century unfolded, there was one group of individuals who were dedicated, almost obsessed, with perfecting their mornings: scientists. But these weren't the typical grab coffee, check emails, get to work types of morning routines you might be familiar with. Oh, no. These scientists were pushing the boundaries of self-discipline, using their mornings for some pretty bizarre activities. They were convinced that these strange habits would not only improve their mental acuity, but also their overall productivity and health. And who knows, maybe there's something to it. One of the most interesting aspects of Victorian scientists' morning routines is how often they revolved around highly ritualized actions, sometimes even bordering on the absurd. Many scientists, like the famous Charles Darwin, were known for their very rigid schedules, beginning at the crack of dawn, determined to maximize every moment of their day, while most people today might groggily hit snooze for the 12th time. These scientists were engaging in a variety of practices that are strange by today's standards. The weirdest part: they believe that their eccentric routines help them think better, live healthier, and even stave off disease. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we need to look at just how early these scientists rose. Spoiler alert, it's probably earlier than you can even imagine. Imagine having to drag yourself out of a warm, comfy bed at 4 a.m. You'd be struggling. Right? Well, for many of these Victorian minds, that was just the beginning of a day filled with what seemed like pure madness. And yet, these routines were often viewed as essential, the key to unlocking their genius. You wake up at 4 a.m., but not for the usual reasons. The sun hasn't even thought about rising yet, and the world outside is still cloaked in that deep blue haze. But for Victorian scientists, this early hour wasn't just a wake-up time. It was a calculated start to a highly structured, intensely productive day. Imagine setting your alarm for the ungodly hour of 4 a.m., and instead of dragging yourself out of bed, you actually spring into action. Sounds insane, doesn't it? Well, not to them. Historically, the 19th century was a time when people were hyper-focused on optimizing their routines, especially in the scientific community. If you were a Victorian scientist, early rising was a badge of honor. And while the benefits of an early start are often debated today, mostly by people who prefer to snooze their alarms, back then, it was seen as essential for anyone looking to make their mark in science. There was a widespread belief that getting up at the crack of dawn gave you an edge, extra time for thinking, reflecting, and being productive before the world around you woke up and distracted you. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds grueling. And you'd be right. It's a struggle to imagine today. given how hard it can be to roll out of bed before the sun's up. But these Victorian minds didn't just wake up at a ridiculous hour. They woke up with a purpose. They had specific things they believed they had to do in the early morning hours to get the best mental clarity possible. And, in some cases, it wasn't about just waking up. It was about forcing your mind and body into action. They had their reasons, and in a way, their crazy habits might even seem relatable, or, at least, that's what they hoped. Take Sir Isaac Newton, for example. Although a few centuries before the Victorian era, his rigorous work schedule served as the perfect model for many of these later scientists. Newton was notorious for working obsessively through the night, sometimes barely sleeping at all. But by the Victorian age, the idea of working through the night had morphed into a more strategic approach. It wasn't just about pulling all-nighters. It was about being up early, fully rested, and ready to tackle the most difficult problems right away. By 4 a.m., many Victorian scientists were already dressed, often in full suits and coats, no slipping back into pajamas here. The morning routine was just as formal as their professional attire. And the reason for this early rising, they believed that their minds were at their sharpest in the quiet hours of the morning. No distractions, no interruptions, just pure thought. But here's the kicker. Their mornings didn't just begin with a simple wake-up call. It was more of an intricate ritual. The idea was to wake up and shake off the mental fog that came from sleeping. It was about activating both body and mind in the most efficient way possible. And that's where the fun part begins. Cold showers, ice baths. You've heard of them, but you've probably never considered starting your day with them. Yet, for many Victorian scientists, a plunge into icy water was a morning must-do. They weren't just taking a cold shower to feel refreshed. No. They were going all in on cold water therapy, with the belief that it would wake up their senses and stimulate the brain for the long, mentally demanding day ahead. The obsession with cold water was part of the broader Victorian fascination with health fads. Think of it as their version of a wellness trend. Cold baths were touted as the key to mental clarity and physical resilience. And some of these scientists swore by them, convinced that exposure to frigid water in the morning helped improve circulation, boost mood, and sharpen the mind. In fact, they were convinced that regular cold water exposure was an essential tool in the quest for a productive and healthy life. So, let's say you're a Victorian scientist living in London. It's 4:30 a.m. The sun is still nowhere in sight, and you've already pulled yourself out of bed. The next step, a cold water bath. You don't start with warm water to ease into it. No, that would be too easy. Instead, you strip down and plunge yourself into ice-cold water, sometimes even in outdoor tubs, to shock your body awake. The thought of it makes you shiver just thinking about it. But for them, it was a routine that had been touted for centuries. The water, according to many of them, cleared the fog in the brain, allowing for better focus and productivity. This ritual wasn't just about physical awakening. For many, it was a mental exercise as well. The cold water immersion was meant to bring clarity, sharpen thinking, and enhance concentration. The famous writer and philosopher Bertrand Russell even swore by it, often writing about how the shock of cold water in the morning helped him think more clearly and focus more deeply throughout his day. It's easy to dismiss this as pure madness in today's world, but you can almost understand their reasoning. The Victorians were obsessed with harnessing the full potential of their minds and bodies. They believed that embracing discomfort and subjecting themselves to physical strain could push their minds into new realms of creativity and discovery. Plus, cold water therapy was just part of the broader medical thinking at the time, which was heavily influenced by ancient practices, including those of Hippocrates, who prescribed cold baths for everything from fever to depression. Now, did it actually help them think better? Historians still argue over whether the cold water practices truly improved cognitive function, or if they were simply a trend fueled by the belief that suffering brought about strength. Some psychologists even suggest that the sensation of shock from cold water could be a form of psychological priming, where the mind is made more alert and focused due to the sudden change in physical state. Regardless of the scientific outcome, one thing is clear. These routines were far from ordinary. They were a part of a larger narrative of pushing the limits, exploring the mind and body in ways that most of us today would find too extreme to even consider. Breakfast in the Victorian era was nothing like the quick bowl of cereal or coffee we might grab today. No. Victorian scientists had a very different approach to starting their day, and it often involved eating massive, hearty meals that would make even the most ravenous among us feel stuffed. Imagine sitting down to a plate of porridge, eggs, bacon, and even beef, all before you've even had your first sip of tea. For them, breakfast was a crucial part of their morning routine, and not just in terms of nourishment, but also as a mental preparation for the day's intellectual battles. It might sound excessive by today's standards, but these meals were seen as essential fuel for the body and mind. The Victorians believed that the quality of your breakfast directly influenced the quality of your work later in the day. It wasn't about skimping on calories or focusing on light, quick meals like a smoothie or yogurt. No. These scientists were after something far more substantial, hoping that the richness of their breakfast would provide them with the energy and stamina needed for hours of deep thought and experimentation. One of the most popular breakfasts involved a large serving of porridge, a steady staple that warmed the body and provided slow-burning energy. Alongside that, there would often be eggs, fried bacon, and toast, creating a hearty foundation for a productive day. But for some, the true power of breakfast came from more unusual choices. Some scientists added beef to their morning meals, swearing by the high-protein start as a means of ensuring mental sharpness. The beef wasn't just for sustenance, it was seen as brain food that would help them tackle the day's intellectual challenges with vigor. But here's the odd part. These hearty breakfasts weren't just meant to energize. They were thought to prepare the body for rigorous intellectual labor. While modern-day scientists, and most of us, might favor lighter, quick meals, these Victorian minds believed that a heavy, protein-packed breakfast would fuel their brains as much as their bodies. This was a time when science was largely about hard work and long hours. Getting through a day of experiments, writing, and theorizing required every ounce of mental and physical energy. Historians still argue whether this heavy breakfast regimen truly made a difference in their productivity, or if it was more a psychological comfort, a belief that the right food would lead to the right ideas. There's even debate about whether this excessive intake of fats and proteins might have hindered some of their physical health in the long run. Still, one thing was clear. If you were a Victorian scientist, your morning routine was nothing to be taken lightly. It was a ritual, with breakfast being an essential part of the mental armor needed to face the day's work. Some would argue that today's modern approach to breakfast, focusing on light and nutritious meals, is far healthier. But maybe, just maybe, there's something to be said about the power of a good, filling meal in preparing for the mental challenges ahead. Could a plate of eggs and beef really set your mind into overdrive? These scientists certainly believed it did. Now, imagine this. It's early morning, the sun is barely peeking over the horizon, and you're stepping out into the cool, misty streets of Victorian London. There's a slight chill in the air, the ground damp with dew, and a silence hanging over the streets like a blanket. But instead of rushing to work or getting into a car, you're taking a slow, deliberate walk. And this walk, well, it's an essential part of your morning routine if you're a Victorian scientist. For many, the morning walk wasn't just about getting some fresh air or stretching your legs after a night's sleep. It was a form of mental preparation. These walks weren't necessarily long or strenuous, but they were slow, quiet, and reflective. You could think, breathe, and ease into the day. It's almost like a meditative practice, a time to focus your mind and make sense of your thoughts before you plunged into the intellectual challenges that awaited you. The idea was to set the tone for the day, clear your head, and get the blood flowing. And of course, in the foggy London streets, there was always a sense of mystery that added to the atmosphere. The early morning stroll was more than just exercise. It was a form of intellectual preparation. Scientists like Charles Darwin, who famously spent long hours walking the paths of his garden and the surrounding countryside, believed that walking helped to free the mind. It was a time when their most brilliant thoughts often struck them. Darwin, in particular, even mentioned in his diaries how walking helped him to think through his ideas, particularly the complex ones related to his theory of evolution. For him, walking wasn't just a passive activity. It was an active part of the thinking process. But walking wasn't limited to famous figures like Darwin. Many other Victorian intellectuals, scientists, and philosophers adopted this practice, making it a cornerstone of their morning routine. It was, for them, a way to ease into the day's work, creating a clear mental space before diving into intense focus. Walking, they believed, stimulated the mind and allowed for better cognitive function. The rhythm of the movement, the steady pace, the quiet. These elements allowed the mind to process thoughts more freely. Historians still argue whether the physical benefits of walking, the blood flow, the gentle exercise, were the real reasons these scientists were so keen on their morning strolls, or if there was something more metaphysical at play. Some believe that the act of walking allowed the mind to wander in a way that seeded the most profound insights. Either way, it's clear that these walks weren't just for exercise. They were, in a sense, a key part of the creative process. For the Victorians, thinking wasn't confined to the desk or laboratory. It often happened in those quiet, reflective moments outside. In today's world, the idea of a thinking walk may seem somewhat out of place. Yet, there's something incredibly refreshing about the thought of walking without distractions, without screens or phones. It's not hard to see why these Victorian minds found such value in it. Now, let's talk about tea. To us, it's simply the drink we grab when we need a quick pick-me-up. But for Victorian scientists, it was so much more. In fact, tea was practically sacred. This wasn't just about having a cup of something warm to sip. It was an entire ritual, one that had as much to do with the mind as it did with the body. Tea wasn't just a caffeine fix. It was believed to sharpen the senses, soothe nerves, and even help focus the mind. If the cold plunge wasn't quite your style, tea was there to give you the mental clarity you needed to start the day. This fascination with tea wasn't just about the physical effects of caffeine. No, for many Victorian scientists, tea was part of a calming ritual, a moment of peaceful contemplation before the storm of intellectual work. The act of brewing tea, pouring it into delicate cups, and sipping slowly became an integral part of their morning routine. Think about it. The Victorians were living in an era of rapid change. With technological advances and the expansion of science and industry, life was increasingly stressful, and their lives often moved at breakneck speed. Tea provided a grounding force, a simple, calming element in an otherwise chaotic world. Charles Darwin, again a key figure in this story, was known to start his mornings with a cup of tea. But it wasn't just any tea. It was part of his highly structured routine, a small yet significant ritual that helped him mentally prepare for the challenges ahead. For Darwin, it was a moment of stillness before diving into the intellectual and scientific work of the day. Tea, as he saw it, wasn't just a beverage. It was an essential element of his mental clarity. But tea was more than just about mental calmness. It was also about physical health. Many Victorian scientists drank their tea for the supposed health benefits. There was a belief that tea could aid digestion, improve circulation, and even help stave off diseases. Tea was seen as a tonic for the body and mind, a brew that could ease fatigue and prevent illness. The Chinese had been drinking tea for centuries, and by the time it reached Victorian England, it was treated almost as a medicinal drink. Historians still debate whether tea had any real medicinal benefits, but it's clear that for these scientists, the psychological impact of the ritual was just as important. Tea was a moment of quiet in the midst of a busy day, a time to reflect and gather your thoughts. It wasn't just about drinking a cup of something warm, it was about creating a space for mental clarity and focus. In today's world, we often hear about the benefits of tea, particularly green tea, in improving brain function and overall well-being. Could the Victorians have been onto something? Perhaps the calming effects of tea are what helped these scientists unlock their creative potential and intellectual breakthroughs. After all, if you believe in the power of tea to clear your mind and refresh your spirit, then it might just be the perfect way to start the day. In a world where most people are running on little more than caffeine and sheer willpower, the idea of taking naps might seem like an indulgence. But for Victorian scientists, napping wasn't just acceptable, it was encouraged. In fact, many of them saw midday naps as a necessary part of their daily routine, essential for recharging the brain after hours of intense mental work. While today's productivity culture tends to frown upon napping as lazy back in the Victorian era, it was viewed as a legitimate strategy for maintaining mental sharpness and emotional well-being. Take the famous scientist and polymath Sir Michael Faraday, for example. Faraday, renowned for his groundbreaking work in electromagnetism, made sure that his schedule included short naps during the day. He believed that a nap allowed him to refresh his mind, recharge his body, and continue working at his best. It wasn't about sleeping for hours. It was about giving the brain a brief break from the onslaught of thoughts and problems. These midday naps were often just 20 to 30 minutes, just long enough to reset the mind before plunging back into work. It might seem counterproductive, but these short naps were seen as vital to sustaining high levels of productivity. In fact, this idea of power napping has been around for centuries, though the Victorians took it to heart more than most. Many of these scientists believed that the act of napping wasn't just about resting, it was about enhancing cognitive function. The theory was that the brain needed periodic breaks to avoid mental fatigue, which could lead to errors in judgment and thinking. By taking a nap, They could come back to their work feeling mentally sharp and ready to tackle whatever problem was next. Interestingly, the concept of napping wasn't just confined to the realm of the scientific elite. Naps were seen as an essential part of maintaining good health and focus across Victorian society. Some even considered napping a form of self-discipline, an act that allowed the mind to regroup and stay at its peak performance level. Faraday was far from alone in adopting this practice. Many of his colleagues in science, as well as other intellectuals, believed in the power of a midday nap to improve productivity. Historians still argue whether these naps truly had a physiological impact on cognition. Some scientists today suggest that short naps can improve memory consolidation and help with problem solving. And modern research supports the idea that a brief afternoon nap can boost cognitive function. So, while Victorian scientists may have been onto something, perhaps they weren't entirely out of their minds with their midday rests after all. Could a short nap really be the secret to unlocking your best work? For most of us, the idea of taking a midday break and resting our brains feels somewhat rebellious. But maybe that's because we've forgotten how important it is to care for our minds. What if we, too, embrace the art of the afternoon nap? The Victorian scientists certainly seemed to think it was an essential part of their mental toolkit. If you thought that plunging into icy water or taking naps were extreme, wait until you hear about the exercise regimens some Victorian scientists swore by. It wasn't just about the typical early morning stretches or light jogs. No, these thinkers were committed to intense, sometimes downright eccentric, physical routines designed to enhance their mental clarity and overall health. Some believed that rigorous physical exertion was the key to maximizing brain power, but these weren't your typical workout routines. These were bizarrely specific regimens that seemed straight out of a 19th century fitness craze. One particularly odd practice was the idea of paddling to enhance circulation. This wasn't paddling a boat on a calm lake. No. It was a type of vigorous physical therapy involving the repeated slapping of the body with a paddle. The idea behind it was that by stimulating the skin and muscles in such a direct way, it would increase blood flow and boost overall energy. This was thought to invigorate the body and clear the mind. And some scientists were convinced it was an essential part of their morning routine. As unusual as it sounds, it was one of many practices that combined physical stimulation with the belief that the body and mind were inseparably linked. In addition to paddling, there was also a fascination with calisthenics, the kind that would make you break a sweat before breakfast. Some scientists believe that rigorous exercise, including bodyweight exercises like push-ups, dips, and sit-ups, was essential for keeping the body in peak condition to handle the intellectual demands of the day. The logic was simple. If you could push your body to its limits, your brain would also push beyond its limits, unlocking new levels of creativity and problem solving. It sounds intense, but these scientists were not shy about putting their minds and bodies through the ringer. The famous scientist and writer Thomas Huxley was known for his belief in the importance of physical fitness. Huxley, who made great contributions to biology and evolutionary theory, was also an advocate for staying in shape. He considered physical exercise to be essential for maintaining mental sharpness. He wasn't just focusing on physical health, he was obsessed with how exercise could promote mental clarity, helping him to think more deeply and more effectively. It's a fascinating intersection of body and mind, a concept that's only gained more attention in recent years with the rise of discussions on the connection between physical health and cognitive function. Historians still argue whether these intense regimens were truly beneficial to the mind or if they were simply acts of personal eccentricity. Some modern-day scientists believe that physical activity can certainly improve brain function. while others argue that excessive or extreme physical exercise might have been more harmful than helpful. Regardless of the debate, one thing is certain. These scientists believed that pushing the body to its physical limits had an important role in unlocking their mental potential. Could it be that this obsession with extreme fitness had an actual impact on their tours and their intellectual success? Or was it just another quirky ritual that seemed to work for them in a time when the lines between physical and mental health were far less clear? Regardless, these scientists were clearly willing to go to great lengths to improve their productivity, whether that meant paddling themselves into a state of alertness or pushing their muscles until exhaustion. Let's step into the world of Victorian hygiene and fashion. Because, believe it or not, the way these scientists dressed and maintained their personal cleanliness was part of their morning routine too. It wasn't just about brushing teeth or combing your hair. Oh no, for these intellectuals. Their morning rituals extended into the realm of hygiene, clothing, and even the very rituals they used to maintain an appearance of orderliness and discipline. But here's the catch. Their commitment to cleanliness and appearance wasn't always as practical as it sounds. For one, Victorian scientists were often dressed to the nines in heavy, restrictive clothing. You'd think that a lab coat and a pair of comfortable shoes would be enough for someone doing intellectual work. But not these gentlemen and ladies. No, their routines often involved donning heavy suits, waistcoats, and even top hats if they were stepping out. This was more than just vanity. It was a way of maintaining a sense of order and discipline, both in their outward appearance and their internal processes. To these scientists, looking professional was not only a reflection of their intellectual capacity, but also a way of signaling that their work had significance. You dressed the part if you were doing important things. But let's not forget the hygienic side of things. Victorian cleanliness standards were a little extreme, and many scientists adhered to routines that might seem a bit obsessive by modern standards. The Victorians were heavily influenced by emerging ideas about germs and disease. So personal cleanliness became an obsession. Baths were often taken daily, which was considered a progressive idea at the time, especially when compared to the practices of earlier centuries. But the bathing rituals were far more elaborate than just a quick dip. For some, it meant scrubbing themselves vigorously with special brushes or using a variety of oils and potions to keep their skin pure. The obsession with cleanliness wasn't just about personal hygiene. It was connected to the broader idea of mental clarity. The act of cleaning oneself was seen as a way of removing mental and physical impurities that could hinder intellectual work. The mind, they believed, could only function at its best when the body was in peak condition, and cleanliness played an important role in that. For some Victorian scientists, a clean body meant a clean mind, and the two went hand in hand in achieving maximum productivity. However, some scholars still debate whether these cleanliness rituals were truly beneficial or just a product of the social norms of the time. Was this obsession with hygiene and appearance actually helping these thinkers reach their potential? Or was it simply another form of mental preoccupation? Did wearing a crisp suit and having meticulously polished shoes actually improve their intellectual output? Or was it just the result of Victorian-era pressures to conform to rigid social standards? There's also the question of how practical these morning rituals really were. While it's easy to see how the act of dressing neatly could help you feel like you're ready to tackle anything, wearing a heavy waistcoat and a stiff shirt every morning doesn't seem particularly conducive to intellectual freedom. And yet, for many of these scientists, the act of maintaining a formal, clean appearance was part of setting the right mental tone for the day. It was about creating an environment where everything had its place, both inside and out. By now, you've probably noticed a theme. Routine. It wasn't just a matter of brushing your teeth or gulping down coffee before diving into work. For Victorian scientists, routine was everything. It was the backbone of their intellectual productivity. They didn't just wake up and start their work at random. Each part of their morning was carefully structured, each task contributing to their mental clarity and physical well-being. They believed that a well-planned day, with every moment accounted for, was essential to achieving great things. But what exactly made this routine so effective? At the core of these routines was the concept of habit. Victorian scientists understood that habits, when built correctly, could improve focus, boost productivity, and even aid in the development of new ideas. They weren't just working hard, they were working smart, developing habits that allowed their minds to work at full capacity. And these habits weren't limited to the morning. The idea of routine extended throughout the entire day, from how they structured their work to how they structured their breaks, naps, and leisure time. The idea of routine wasn't just some philosophical concept. It was a practical approach to time management. Take the famous scientist and philosopher William Whewell, for example. Whewell was an advocate of routine and would plan his day meticulously, ensuring that there was a time for study, reflection, and physical activity. He firmly believed that routines helped the mind stay sharp and focused, cutting down on distractions and improving efficiency. To him, being strict with his schedule was the secret to his success. But here's the twist. While routine was considered the key to success, it wasn't just about discipline. It was also about giving the mind the freedom it needed to be creative. Routine didn't mean being a mindless robot. It meant creating a structure where creativity could flourish. The strict routine created space for thinking, reflection, and deep work, all of which were essential for scientific discovery. This balance between discipline and freedom, between structure and creativity, is what allowed these scientists to produce groundbreaking work. Historians still argue whether the obsession with routine was truly effective in increasing productivity, or if it was merely a way for these scientists to feel in control of their often chaotic and stressful work environments. While some modern-day productivity experts may argue that a looser approach to time management is more effective, it's clear that the Victorian scientists believed that a rigid routine was a key part of their success. Could it be that the reason these scientists were able to produce so much was because they simply didn't leave anything to chance? By removing the decision-making process for things like when to work, when to rest, and when to eat, they created a seamless flow that allowed them to focus on what mattered most, their intellectual pursuits. So, while it may seem a bit extreme to us today, the rigid routine was more than just a set of rules. It was a tool to unlock productivity, creativity, and even happiness. Eccentricity, it's practically synonymous with the Victorian era. From their fascination with the unknown to their wildly inventive and sometimes bizarre approaches to problem solving. The Victorians were a society full of oddities, and that, of course, extended to their scientists. While many might have adhered to disciplined routines and a structured lifestyle, there was always room for the unusual and the strange. It was almost as if the key to unlocking the mind's creative potential lay in doing things that most people would dismiss as eccentric, or perhaps even a little mad. One of the more peculiar habits of Victorian scientists was their fondness for mental exercises, often in the form of games, puzzles, or even absurd challenges designed to stimulate the brain in creative ways. Charles Babbage, for instance, the father of the computer, was not just obsessed with numbers and machines. He was also deeply invested in mental exercises. He would often test himself with complex problems or engage in intricate mental calculations just to stretch his mind. But that's not all. There were also strange rituals, like trying to memorize absurdly large lists of random words or pushing his brain to its limits by solving puzzles that made little sense but were thought to be good for cognitive flexibility. Then there was the case of the notorious scientist William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, who was fascinated by the idea of mental discipline. He believed that any mind could be trained to be sharper, just like a muscle could be toned through exercise. To do this, he often relied on highly repetitive mental exercises, such as mentally calculating complex formulas over and over again until they became second nature. Some would argue that such eccentricities were a waste of time. But for Victorian scientists, these peculiar mental workouts were believed to be key to honing intellectual clarity and creativity. Historians still argue whether these eccentric exercises truly sharpened the intellect or if they were just ways to pass time. Some believe they were simply a way for scientists to maintain mental agility in an age where most intellectual work required a vast amount of memorization and manual calculation. Others argue that these practices were perhaps more about keeping the mind active rather than being strictly productive. Regardless, the eccentric mental exercises were certainly a part of the broader trend among Victorian scientists to treat the mind like an instrument that could be finely tuned, stretched, and challenged. What's even more interesting is that this kind of intellectual eccentricity wasn't just a feature of the scientific community. It permeated broader Victorian culture, influencing artists, writers, and philosophers who also believed in the need for mental stimulation through creative, if not downright odd, activities. Whether it was writing in a secret code or challenging oneself to memorize long strings of random information, these intellectuals all seemed to agree that eccentricity was an essential part of their creative process. Could it be that their odd habits were not just eccentricities for the sake of eccentricity, but an attempt to break free from the constraints of conventional thinking? In a world where the scientific community was undergoing rapid transformation, perhaps these eccentric practices were a way for the Victorians to open new pathways for creative thought and scientific discovery. There's certainly something to be said about the power of shaking up the brain's routine in unexpected ways, no matter how odd it might seem. All right, now let's move on to something a bit more gruesome. Breakfast might have been full of rich, hearty foods. But for some Victorian scientists, their mornings also involved something a little darker: bloodletting. Yes, you read that right. In the 19th century, bloodletting was still considered a legitimate practice to purge the body of toxins and maintain overall health, despite the fact that its scientific merit was rapidly declining. But for some Victorian thinkers, the belief in bloodletting had a peculiar place in their morning routine. Take, for example, the famous chemist and physician Michael Faraday. While he is most well known for his groundbreaking discoveries in electromagnetism, he also believed in the power of bloodletting for maintaining good health. Faraday's morning routine reportedly involved a bit of self-care that included a very brief and rather uncomfortable session of bloodletting to clear the mind. He wasn't the only one. Many prominent scientists, doctors, and philosophers during the Victorian era believed that removing a small amount of blood would help to prevent illness and promote mental clarity. The idea was that the body could function more effectively if its humors were balanced, and bloodletting was considered one way to restore that balance. The practice, often done with leeches or through a simple incision, was a form of therapy that had been popular since ancient times. But it lingered into the Victorian era longer than one might expect. Many of the era's brightest minds were convinced of its benefits. Some even argued that bloodletting helped clear the brain. ensuring that the person could think more clearly and approach intellectual work with greater focus. Historians still debate whether bloodletting ever truly had any health benefits, or if it was simply a misunderstood practice clung to by the medical community. Some believe that these early scientists might have thought the practice worked. But modern research suggests it likely did more harm than good. Still, these rituals continued well into the 19th century, even as more scientifically sound methods of treatment emerged. Why would these intelligent minds hold on to such practices? Perhaps it was a combination of tradition and the era's medical limitations. Could there have been some merit to the bloodletting craze? It's hard to say. Some modern physicians argue that there may be some value to controlled blood loss in certain conditions. But it certainly wasn't a magic bullet for intellectual improvement, as Victorian scientists might have hoped. Still, it's fascinating to think about how even the most enlightened minds of the era held on to these practices, believing they were an integral part of their morning routine. In a way, it makes sense. The 9th century was an era of medical discovery, but also an era where much of the world still lay in the shadows of misunderstanding. For these scientists, bloodletting might have been just another ritual they felt would clear their minds, along with the cold water baths, tea, and rigorous exercise. After all, when you're trying to find the truth of the universe, sometimes you'll try anything, no matter how odd it might seem today. Now, let's move from the gruesome to the fragrant, where smell played a surprising role in the morning routines of some Victorian scientists. In a world where hygiene and cleanliness were becoming increasingly important, the use of fragrances, oils, and perfumes wasn't just about masking odors. It was about stimulating the senses and creating the right mental environment for deep intellectual work. If cold baths, naps, and bloodletting didn't quite do the trick, the right scent could, or so they believed. The Victorian era was obsessed with scent. Fragrance wasn't just an accessory for the wealthy. It was an integral part of everyday life. For many scientists, especially those working long hours in stuffy labs or dark libraries, using perfumes and oils became a way to clear their minds and keep them sharp. The scents weren't just for masking unpleasant odors. They were thought to have specific psychological and physiological effects that could improve focus, reduce stress, and even aid in creativity. Take, for example, the use of lavender and rosemary, which were often used to promote mental clarity. Some scientists, like the biologist Richard Owen, were known to use essential oils like these, diffusing them in their workspace or even using them as personal fragrances. Lavender, in particular, was believed to soothe the nerves and promote calmness, while rosemary was thought to stimulate the mind and improve memory. The idea was that certain fragrances could help open up the mind, sharpen focus, and enhance intellectual productivity. Historians still debate whether these oils and fragrances truly had the mind-boosting effects that the Victorians claimed, or if they were simply a way to indulge in a ritual of self-care. Some argue that the scent of lavender could have had a mild sedative effect, helping the mind relax and focus. Others suggest that it was more about the psychological association of a familiar, pleasant scent that helped put the mind at ease, allowing for more productive thinking. Regardless, it's clear that these oils and fragrances had a significant place in the morning routines of some Victorian intellectuals. But it wasn't just lavender and rosemary. Many Victorians were also fond of exotic scents, like those derived from rose petals, jasmine, and even citrus. These fragrances were often used in combination, with some scientists creating complex blends of oils to stimulate specific mental states. The use of fragrance became a way to create a sensory environment conducive to thinking and creating. Much like we today might use a favorite candle or essential oil to create a calm or energized atmosphere. Could these fragrances have truly had an impact on mental performance? Or were they just another eccentric indulgence? The truth is that modern science has found that scent can affect cognition and mood in various ways. So there's likely some truth to the idea that fragrance played a role in stimulating the mind. Whether it was lavender's calming effect or rosemary's stimulating properties, it's possible that these scents helped set the right mental tone for the scientific breakthroughs that came next. Perhaps, in today's world, we're a little more skeptical of the power of smell to directly improve mental function. But there's no denying that the act of engaging the senses in a purposeful way, whether through fragrance, music, or even environment, has been shown to support focus and creativity. Maybe the Victorian scientists weren't entirely off base in their olfactory rituals after all. It's a well-known fact that some of history's greatest thinkers spent their mornings in deep contemplation, often in solitude, disconnected from the noise of the world around them. But the morning ritual wasn't just about physical activities, exercise, or even mental puzzles. For many Victorian scientists, their morning routine served as a sacred time for philosophical reflection, introspection, and exploration of the deeper questions that consumed them. It was a moment for quiet thought, where they could wrestle with the profound mysteries of life, the universe, and everything in between. One such scientist who embraced this reflective time was the polymath Charles Lyell, a geologist whose work laid the foundations for Darwin's theory of evolution. Lyell was notorious for using his mornings not just to study the Earth, but to wrestle with the philosophical implications of his findings. Every morning, he would wake early, often before dawn, and spend time in solitude reflecting on the natural world and its mysteries. His routine was structured around these moments of quiet thought, where he could turn over his ideas, examine them from every angle, and contemplate what the evidence was telling him about the nature of time, life, and the planet's history. This reflective morning time was vital to the work that would eventually reshape our understanding of geology. For others, the time alone was also an opportunity to delve into the philosophical side of their work. Thomas Henry Huxley, another major figure of the Victorian scientific era, used his morning routines to reflect on the broader implications of science. His quiet morning moments were spent contemplating not just the physical world, but the ethical and philosophical questions that arose from scientific discovery. These early hours provided him with the clarity and peace of mind to grapple with complex moral issues, like the relationship between science and religion or the responsibilities of scientists to society. Historians still argue about how essential these moments of philosophical reflection truly were to the scientific process. Was it during these quiet times that the greatest breakthroughs occurred, or were they merely a distraction from the more practical aspects of scientific discovery? Many argue that these contemplative mornings were vital because they allowed the mind to make creative connections, insights that were not the result of the grind of daily work, but rather the peaceful reflection that came from being alone with one's thoughts. The quiet hours allowed these scientists to synthesize complex ideas, sometimes months or years of data, into coherent theories. In today's world, it's easy to be distracted by the noise of daily life, the rush of emails, meetings, phone calls, and social media. But for the Victorian scientists, their morning routine of solitude and philosophical reflection was not a luxury. It was a necessary tool. It gave them space to think deeply and freely, without external distractions, allowing them to make sense of the world around them. Could this reflective time be what fueled their intellectual breakthroughs, perhaps, in a world so full of noise? We could all benefit from a little quiet time to contemplate, think, and truly connect with our ideas. It's no secret that moments of quiet solitude are becoming harder and harder to come by in our modern world, where technology often dictates our every moment. But these Victorian scientists had the luxury and, for many, the discipline of carving out time to reflect. And in those quiet hours, many of them made their most profound discoveries. It's a reminder that perhaps the key to some of the greatest intellectual achievements lies not in the frantic rush of daily life, but in the quiet spaces we create for thought, reflection, and imagination. As we reach the end of our journey through the peculiar morning routines of Victorian scientists, it's fascinating to reflect on how much of their day was dedicated to self-care, discipline, and let's be honest, outright eccentricity. After all the early rising, cold plunges, heavy breakfasts, and eccentric habits, you might think these scientists would simply collapse into bed after a day of intense intellectual work. But, as with their mornings, their evenings were just as methodically planned and carefully curated. It seems that even their relaxation time was part of the equation for a productive mind. Some of the greatest scientific minds of the Victorian era had quite elaborate nighttime rituals. These routines weren't just about winding down. They were an extension of their obsession with productivity and mental clarity. For example, the famous philosopher and biologist Alfred Russel Wallace had a well-established bedtime routine. Wallace, co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection, would often spend his evenings reflecting on the work he'd done that day. But his routine didn't just end with mental exercises. Like many of his peers, he'd also engage in physical relaxation techniques to prepare his body for sleep, understanding that a well-rested body was just as important as a well-rested mind. But Wallace's routine was a bit unique, as he often used his evenings for reading, especially books related to his scientific work. This nightly ritual of reading, however, wasn't just about knowledge acquisition. It was about unwinding and processing the information he had absorbed during the day. In some ways, it was his version of a mental cool-down, where he could reflect on his ideas and theories in a less intense, more contemplative manner. Other scientists, such as Charles Darwin, also had an almost obsessive approach to winding down. For Darwin, the end of the day was an opportunity to engage in his own brand of brain maintenance. He was known for writing detailed notes in the evenings, recounting his thoughts and reflecting on the day's work. This wasn't just a productivity hack. Darwin believed that by organizing his thoughts at the end of the day, he could prepare his mind for more productive work the next morning. It's a fascinating example of how even the most brilliant minds needed structure in their downtime to maximize their potential. Historians still debate whether these evening routines were necessary, or if they simply reflected the Victorian obsession with structure and self-discipline. Some argue that these scientists were simply caught up in the culture of relentless productivity, while others believe that this combination of physical rest and mental organization was integral to their creative success. Regardless of the outcome of this debate, there's no doubt that their routines were a product of their time, an era that valued mental fortitude, intellectual rigor, and an unwavering commitment to progress. It's intriguing to consider that these scientists didn't just rest at night. They actively prepared themselves for the intellectual challenges that awaited them the next day. They understood that mental clarity didn't come from simply working harder, but from carefully managing their physical and mental well-being. Their morning and evening routines were an intricate dance between work and rest, between pushing the body and nurturing the mind. Now, as we finish up our exploration of these unusual routines, it's important to take a step back and consider what we can learn from these Victorian minds. In today's world, where distractions are endless and the pace of life is unrelenting, we might find it useful to embrace some of their methods, the importance of routine, the value of reflection, and the role of self-discipline in achieving personal and professional success. Perhaps, too, we can appreciate the quieter moments, the times of stillness that allow our minds to wander and explore the great ideas that await us. So, as we wind down our own day, remember that just like those Victorian scientists, we all need our rituals, small acts of care that prepare us for the challenges ahead. Whether it's a cup of tea, a quiet walk, or a few minutes of reflection, these moments give us the clarity we need to continue our own intellectual and personal journeys. Now, take a deep breath. Let the day's thoughts drift away and allow yourself to rest, knowing that the most creative and brilliant minds of history didn't achieve greatness just through work, but through careful self-care and dedicated routine.